All right. Once George Washington had left the presidency, there was a great deal of uncertainty because there was going to be the first true election in the United States that would include a popular vote. And really, the founders of the Constitution didn't know if what they had planned would work quite the way that they thought. So the election of 1796 is fundamentally between Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. Now, what makes this particular election so fascinating for historians is the complex relationship between Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. So Jefferson and Adams knew each other for really most of their lives. Jefferson was a little bit younger, but they were close enough in age that actually John Adams in particular used to always tell Jefferson that he was sure that he was going to outlive him. For whatever reason, the two men had a bit of a competition to see who would live the longest. They had been friends during the Revolutionary period. They actually shared a lot of ideas, but once the election of 1796 rolls around, they have a much more complex relationship, and actually they stop speaking to each other for a number of years. It's not until John Adams's wife Abigail writes a letter to Thomas Jefferson to offer her condolences when Jefferson's second oldest daughter dies, that Abigail Adams tells Jefferson, "John Adams is far too stubborn to ever be the one to break the silence. You'll have to write him a letter." So Jefferson does. He caves, and he's older. This far after the election. He writes this letter to Adams, and they strike up sort of a renewed friendship. They write letters back and forth during their old age, and they're always ending their letters claiming, one's going to die before the other. And on July 4th, 1824, I think it's 24, not 100% certain, but it is July 4th, 1824, John Adams becomes very ill. And he's on his deathbed. He's surrounded by his family. He had several children. He had an extremely devoted, brilliant wife, Abigail, and he is near death. And reportedly, according to the many people who were in the room with him, John Adams's very last words were, "Jefferson survives." Adams was so stubborn that his very last thought in life was frustration at the fact that he had lost a bet with Thomas Jefferson. However, now of course he never got to know this, but Adams actually outlived Jefferson by just a few hours. Jefferson himself had been very sick. He died only a few hours before Adams, but Jefferson was in Virginia. Adams was in his home state of Massachusetts, and the word had not arrived at the Adams home yet. So, in fact, Jefferson had died just before John Adams, but their final dying thoughts, at least Adams, were about the friendship between the two of them. But before we get all warm and fuzzy about important historical friendships, these two did not always like each other, and the election of 1796 didn't help. So, at the time of the election, there's a few really important issues that Americans are concerned with. One is the French Revolution. The French were experiencing a revolution somewhat similar to the American Revolution, similar in the fact that ideas of the Enlightenment were the philosophical underpinnings of the revolution, but this was a far more bloody, destructive, and disorganized revolution. It lasts from 1789 to 1799, and in spite of those 10 years of conflict, they still end up with a monarchy for many more years. But the issue for Americans was, should the U.S. be sending money to support the French? Jefferson, who had been ambassador to France during the Revolutionary period, Jefferson believed, yes, we should send the money, we should support democracy there, but John Adams said no. Adams believed that the U.S. was in too fragile a position to support a French Revolution or to even spend the money. So Americans were divided on that issue. Another was the Fugitive Slave Law, Fugitive Slave Act, also referred to as the Bloodhound Law of 1793. This is a law that spanned slaveholding states, and it stated that it was legal to capture a slave in a free state if he had escaped from a slave state, and that man could be, or woman could be, returned to the slave owner from which they had fled. It's called the Bloodhound Law because it created a whole economy of headhunters who would go out and try to find these slaves, and in some cases would capture free men who had never been enslaved and would sometimes even drug them or harm them and then bring them to the South where they would be enslaved. Another conflict was over the 11th Amendment of 1794, which states that federal courts cannot hear lawsuits against states, and this really divided Federalists and Anti-Federalists. Now, thinking about the election, John Adams is a Federalist. He supports a larger national government. Thomas Jefferson, once referred to as an Anti-Federalist, is now, and this is where the verbiage gets confusing and you want to pay close attention, Jefferson is now a Democratic Republican. So Anti-Federalist, he's still an Anti-Federalist. He still wants more power in the hands of the states and not the national government. But the terminology changes. Now Anti-Federalists are called Democratic Republicans. Now in the election, John Adams is victorious. Adams wins, but Jefferson gets the second most votes, and he becomes vice president. Now, you might be wondering, I thought presidential candidates got to pick their vice president and pick somebody from their party. Well, we do that now, and that's thanks to Jefferson. Jefferson hated being the vice president of a president who was from a different political party. Ideally, this would force compromise between the two, but in fact, the two of them just decided that they couldn't possibly get along. So ultimately, Adams wins the election of 1796. John Adams, and you can read this quote if you like, I encourage you to do so. John Adams is a brilliant man. He was a lawyer by trade. He became nationally known during the early days of the Revolution when he represented the British soldiers who shot at during the Boston Massacre, even though the generally popular idea among Americans was that British soldiers had instigated the fighting at the Boston Massacre, and they wanted to see those British soldiers executed without a trial. John Adams insisted that we were going to be the kind of country that offers due process of law, that no matter what popular opinion says, no matter who you are due a fair trial. And he represents those British soldiers, and people hate him for it. He exonerates those British soldiers, and people hate him for it. But Adams really did not care what anyone thought of him. He knew what the law said. He knew what kind of country we wanted to be. He knew what would make us different from monarchies and authoritarian governments, and so he studied hard, he toiled, he was away from his wife for 14 years of his life, of their marriage, and he did it because he was trying to lay a foundation for a government where the hard work of creating the laws would be done so that those laws could simply be enforced, so that future generations wouldn't have to worry about framing a government, but they could live free lives under that government. Adams started his presidency wildly popular. Again, not for his personality. He was honestly very rude. He was short-tempered, gruff, impatient, not a classically attractive man, but he stood up to people who defied him, and people respected that. And the best example of Adams doing this is what's referred to as the XYZ affair. Now, the French had been lobbying Adams and his administration to give money for the French Revolution. And Adams agrees that he will send 3 ambassadors from the United States to France, and they're going to meet with the French Foreign Minister Talleyrand. And Adams is already extremely reluctant to support the French in their revolution, but he agrees to send an embassy to go and discuss it, to at least consider the possibility of support. Well, when Adams's ambassadors arrive, and this includes people like John Jay, these are distinguished Americans, they arrive in France expecting to be met by the foreign minister, and these three unknown people, referred to as X, Y, and Z because they didn't know their names, show up and say that if the Americans want to meet with the French foreign minister, they first have to pay them a large sum of money. So essentially they're asking for a bribe to engage in diplomacy. Well, when Adams hears about this, he tells them, you better get on a boat and come back to the United States, because that is not how we talk to other countries. And this standing up to France makes Adams look like a boss. People think, what a tough guy. He's standing up to other nations. He's not letting us be bullied. This makes him exceedingly popular. Until the Alien and Sedition Acts. The greatest failure of the Adams presidency is passing the Alien and Sedition Acts. Adams was not someone easily persuaded by other people's opinions, but throughout the course of his presidency, he had been fed all this information about potential spy rings of Frenchmen who were coming to the United States, and they were getting intelligence and they were sending it back to Europe. So Adams writes all of these laws, revoking citizenship privileges to people of French ancestry, keeping people out, restricting interaction with French businesses. So business owners hate this. People of French descent hated this. The Alien and Sedition Acts allowed the government essentially to spy on people, to have people interrogated, and this breaks down the privacy rights that a lot of Americans felt that they had. And then what makes this even worse is that right near the end of his presidency, Adams makes all of these midnight appointments. He sends these really last-minute appointments for judgeships and other federally appointed positions to other people of his own party right before Thomas Jefferson walks in the door and becomes president. On a side note, even though this woman should never be a side note, his wife, Abigail Adams, is one of the most brilliant, intelligent, and influential women of the Revolutionary period. And if you ever want to read something really beautiful, you should read the letters between the two of them. She was a great deal of inspiration to him in his writing of laws and new policies. She actually had a significant influence over the government that we have today. And if you'd like, you can actually read this. This is an excerpt from a very famous letter written by Abigail Adams to John Adams. This is another piece of writing between the two of them. They affectionately referred to one another as my dearest friend.